transmission came in broken waves, distorted by the static of the void. The voice was barely human, hoarse, shaking, and drenched in terror. "They're here. God help us. Don't come. Don't." The transmission dissolved into a sickening screech. Then silence. In the darkened control room of Earth's Colonial Defense Bureau, the message played on a loop. The faces of those gathered were illuminated only by the cold glow of holographic displays. No one spoke for a long time, until the Director of Operations leaned forward and pressed the replay button with a shaking hand. "We dug too deep. They woke up. They're everywhere." The screen flickered as an image of the Argus 9 colony appeared, a sprawling industrial station embedded into the rocky surface of a barren moon. The footage was time-stamped just hours ago, but the colony now sat in ghostly silence. Emergency lights blinked, casting the empty landing platforms in a blood-red hue. There was no sign of life, only the eerie hum of abandoned machinery. Dr. Elena Voss sat near the back of the room, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest of her chair. She felt the familiar weight of dread settle over her. Argus 9 was no ordinary mining colony. The reports she'd reviewed prior to the meeting hinted at something far more sinister beneath the surface. Classified excavation logs, vague mentions of biological anomalies, and conflicting reports from the company's corporate offices. She glanced at the man standing beside the display, Colonel Marcus Harlan. His face was carved from stone, his eyes locked on the image of the dead colony. His reputation preceded him, a man who had seen more battlefield horrors than most could endure. But even he seemed unsettled by the grim silence on the screen. The director cleared his throat and finally spoke. "We've lost contact with Argus 9. Our last communication was 15 hours ago. There were 312 personnel stationed there. Scientists, miners, security teams. We haven't heard from any of them since the distress signal." He paused, as though the next words physically pained him. "We are initiating a containment response. A recon team will be dispatched immediately. Your mission is to assess the situation and secure the facility. If necessary, neutralize any threats." Neutralize. The word hung in the air like a noose. Colonel Harlan straightened. "What kind of threat are we talking about, sir?" The director's gaze darkened. "We don't know, but based on the signal, we have to assume the worst." Elena's mind raced. Assume the worst. She'd been on enough missions to know what that really meant. Every scenario she imagined ended in horror. She forced herself to speak. "If this is biological, we'll need more than standard containment protocols. The reports from Argus 9 mentioned xenobiological anomalies. What exactly were they digging for?" The director shifted uncomfortably. "That information is classified." "Classified?" Elena's voice hardened. "You're sending us into a disaster zone blind, and you want me to believe you don't know what's down there." "That's enough, Dr. Voss," Harlan interrupted, though his tone wasn't unkind. "We're here to do a job, not argue with command." Elena bit her lip but said nothing more. The director continued. "You'll be deploying in 2 hours. Your orders are simple. Find out what happened and ensure whatever caused this doesn't spread beyond Argus 9. Understood?" Harlan's voice was firm. He turned to Elena and the other crew members gathered. "Suit up. We're leaving now." The meeting dissolved into tense murmurs as the team prepared for departure. Elena stayed behind for a moment, staring at the frozen image of the empty colony. A thin trail of crimson dripped down one of the external cameras, fluid that shouldn't exist in the vacuum of space. She whispered to herself, "What have they done?" The dropship shuddered as it pierced the moon's thin atmosphere, the cockpit's viewport filled with the bleak, rocky expanse of August 9. The landing pad loomed below, its surface cracked and scorched. No one spoke as the craft settled with a metallic groan. Elena felt the tension in her gut twist tighter as she stepped off the dropship. The air was cold and thin, and the silence was deafening. The landing pad was littered with abandoned crates and overturned equipment, as if the crew had fled in panic. A hollow wind howled across the platform, but there were no other sounds. No voices, no footsteps. Colonel Harlan raised his rifle and motioned for the team to spread out. Lieutenant Jason Cato took point, his visor reflecting the flickering red lights as he scanned the perimeter. "No signs of movement," he murmured. They advanced toward the main airlock. The massive steel doors stood ajar, bent and twisted, as though something had forced them open from the inside. Elena felt her stomach lurch. Something had escaped. Inside the colony, the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the narrow corridors. The walls were streaked with something dark, almost black in the dim light. Elena knelt and touched the streak with her glove. It was viscous, like congealed blood. Cato's voice crackled through the comms. "You guys seeing this?" Elena looked up. Her breath caught in her throat. The ceiling above them was lined with what looked like organic growths, fleshy, pulsing sacs clinging to the metal framework. They shivered and twitched as though sensing the team's presence. "Jesus Christ," Harlan muttered. A sudden noise echoed down the hallway, a wet, dragging sound. The team froze. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. From the shadows emerged a man, if he could still be called that. His body was bloated and misshapen, his skin stretched thin over pulsating veins. Strange, bone-like spines jutted from his back, and his eyes were hollow, sunken pits. He stumbled forward, whispering hoarsely, "They're beneath us." Elena stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's head jerked toward her. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and a deep, rattling sound emerged, a sound that wasn't human. Before anyone could react, his body convulsed violently, and his chest burst open in a spray of blood and bone. From the ruin of his torso slithered something hideous, a creature with serrated limbs and translucent worm-like tendrils. It let out a high-pitched screech as it lunged toward the team. "Open fire!" Harlan roared. Gunfire erupted in the narrow corridor. The creature writhed and shrieked as the bullets tore through its grotesque form, but it didn't stop. Elena fell back, her heart pounding as she watched its tendrils lash out, slicing through the air with deadly precision. Finally, a well-placed shot from Cato's rifle struck the creature's head. It let out a final, gurgling scream before collapsing into a twitching heap. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stared at the mangled remains of the creature, bile rising in her throat. "This isn't an accident," she whispered. They knew this was here." Harlan's face was grim as he wiped the blood from his visor. "Whatever they woke up down here." He glanced at the ruined body on the floor. "We're not alone." And in the distance, something else stirred. The descent into the mines felt like stepping into the gullet of some ancient, slumbering beast. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, not the mechanical chill of malfunctioning ventilation, but something primal, something that felt alive. Elena could see her breath fogging in front of her face, and the lights from their helmets barely cut through the encroaching dark. The tunnels were carved deep into the moon's crust, reinforced with steel beams that now sagged like the brittle bones of a decaying carcass. Strange, web-like growths clung to the walls, organic tendrils that pulsed faintly beneath the surface, as though feeding off something unseen. Every step the team took echoed like a heartbeat in the hollow abyss. Colonel Harlan's voice crackled over the comms. "Keep your eyes open and stay close. If something moves, I want to know before it tears us apart." Elena adjusted her scanner, trying to make sense of the distorted readings. The interference was off the charts. Something below them was emitting bursts of electromagnetic noise strong enough to scramble their equipment. Whatever it wasn't natural. Lieutenant Cato knelt by a collapsed section of the tunnel and examined a shattered mining drill. His voice was tight with tension. "This thing's been ripped apart. Not melted, not corroded, just torn. Like something grabbed it and pulled." Elena's stomach churned as she noticed the jagged edges of the drill housing. The metal was bent inward, as though crushed by an immense force. They pressed forward in silence, their boots crunching over shards of rock and debris. The tunnels began to widen, and the walls became smoother, almost polished. Glyphs were carved into the stone, intricate symbols that spiraled and converged in patterns that made Elena's head swim if she stared too long. She reached out and ran her fingers over the carvings. This isn't human," she whispered. "These markings, they predate anything we've seen. This isn't just a mine, it's a tomb." Harlan moved beside her, his face grim beneath his visor. "A tomb for what?" Before Elena could answer, Cato's voice rang out from ahead. "I've got movement, 30 meters down." The team raised their weapons, their helmet lights converging on the end of the tunnel. A faint clicking sound echoed toward them, a wet rhythmic chittering that seemed to multiply, coming from every direction. "Contact," Harlan barked. Shapes emerged from the shadows, thin and serpentine, their bodies glistening with a wet, membrane-like sheen. They moved with a terrifying speed, their limbs unnaturally long and bent at sharp angles. The Xha'ari, one of the creatures, leaped forward, its jagged claws outstretched. The team opened fire, the narrow tunnel filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the flash of muzzle flares. Elena felt the concussive thud of the pulse rifle reverberate through her arms as she fired. The creature's body jerked mid-air as bullets tore through its torso, but it didn't stop. Its claws scraped against the floor as it tumbled, still writhing and hissing until a final shot from Cato split its head open. Another Xha'ari surged toward them, but it wasn't alone. It dragged something behind it, a body. Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized the mangled remains of a miner. But something was wrong. His chest was moving, twitching in time with the creature's breath. Then she saw it, the translucent sac pulsing beneath his ribcage, filled with writhing tendrils. She screamed, "Don't let it!" Before she could finish, the sac burst open, spraying the tunnel with thick, gelatinous fluid. A mass of spine tendrils erupted from the corpse, whipping toward the team with razor-sharp precision. Sergeant Hale, one of the security officers, was caught in the spray. The acidic fluid sizzled as it ate through his armor and skin. His screams filled the comms as the tendrils wrapped around his arms and legs, pulling him apart with grotesque ease. Harlan fired a grenade round into the mass, the explosion ripping apart the fleshy growths and silencing Hale's screams. "Fall back," Harlan shouted, pulling Elena to her feet as more of the creatures slithered down the walls. They retreated into a side passage, sealing a blast door behind them. The sound of claws and tendrils scraping against the steel echoed like nails on a coffin. Elena collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving. Her visor was splattered with gore, and she could still hear Hale's screams ringing in her ears. "They're using them," she whispered. "They're incubating inside them." Cato ripped off his helmet, his face pale and drenched in sweat. This was supposed to be a mining operation. What the hell were they digging for? Elena closed her eyes, remembering the glyphs, the strange carvings etched into the stone. Not minerals, not fuel. They were looking for something ancient, something buried. She swallowed hard, and they found it. Harlan knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. "Whatever it is, it's alive, and it's pissed." A low hum filled the tunnel, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. It wasn't the sound of machinery. It was a heartbeat. The blast door behind them shuddered as something massive struck it. Again and again, the steel began to warp, groaning under the immense pressure. Harlan looked towards the flickering tunnel ahead. "We need to move. Now." Elena nodded, forcing herself to her feet. The team pressed forward, deeper into the heart of the mines. The hum grew louder with each step, an oppressive, suffocating rhythm. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The walls were covered in the same pulsing growths, but here they formed towering spires, grotesque organic monoliths that seemed to pulse with life. In the center of the chamber, something enormous shifted, a mass of chitin and flesh, coiled like a living mountain. Elena's scanner flared red as the readings spiked off the charts. "It's a hive," Cato muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Elena stared at the writhing mass at the heart of the chamber. It was cocooned in layers of translucent membrane, its limbs twitching in restless slumber. But its face, or what passed for a face, was partially visible, a grotesque fusion of bone and sinew, its mouth lined with spiraling rows of teeth. She realized with dawning horror that the Xha'ari weren't just a species. They were a creation, soldiers bred for a singular purpose. And whatever lay cocooned at the heart of the hive, it was their queen. The hum deepened, vibrating through their bones. The queen's eyelids, if they could be called that, peeled back, revealing twin orbs of glistening black. She was waking up. Harlan's voice was sharp. "Set the charges. We're blowing this place to hell." The team moved quickly, placing explosives around the perimeter. Elena's hands shook as she armed the detonators. The Queen's gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if she could feel the human intruders defiling her sanctuary. The walls trembled. The Xha'ari poured from the shadows, their screeches deafening. "Fall back," Harlan bellowed. The team sprinted toward the exit, the detonator in Harlan's hand counting down. The tunnel shook with the force of 1,000 claws chasing them. The timer hit 0. The explosion rocked the chamber, a deafening roar that swallowed their screams. Elena was thrown to the ground as the tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing the hive beneath tons of rock. For a moment, there was silence. Elena lay on her back, staring up at the jagged ceiling. Her breath was ragged, her body bruised and battered, but she was alive. Harlan's voice crackled through the calms. "Status?" Cato's response was weak, but steady. "Alive. Barely." Elena closed her eyes, but the Queen's gaze lingered in her mind. Whatever had been unleashed down here, it wasn't over. "Let's get out of this damn tomb," Harlan muttered. As the team began their ascent, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped anything. The Queen wasn't dead. She was waiting. The return to the surface felt like clawing their way out of a grave. The tunnels behind them groaned as though the moon itself resented their escape. When they finally emerged into the cold, gray wasteland above, the airlock doors sealed shut behind them with a resounding thud. Elena collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The others weren't much better. Cato leaned heavily against the wall, blood trickling down his arm from a deep gash along his shoulder. Colonel Harlan stood with his rifle raised, scanning the empty landing platform with wary eyes. For a brief moment, there was silence. No screeching horrors, no chittering claws scraping against metal. Just the wind. But the weight of what they'd seen still pressed down on them like an anchor. "We need to call this in," Elena finally managed. Her voice was hoarse, raw from breathing in dust and smoke. "Command has to know what's down there." "They already know," Cato muttered darkly. Elena turned to him. "What?" Cato pushed himself off the wall, grimacing as the pain flared in his arm. He looked at Harlan, his eyes burning with fury. "I wasn't sure before, but after seeing that, the encrypted files I found, they weren't reports from Argus 9's crew. They were orders sent to them. They knew what was down there. They sent those people to their deaths." Harlan's face hardened. "Who sent the orders?" Before Cato could respond, the faint hum of an approaching ship cut through the thin atmosphere. A sleek black shuttle descended onto the landing pad, its engines hissing as it settled. The insignia on its side was unmistakable, the emblem of Exoterra Industries, the corporate entity that funded Argus 9's operations. The shuttle doors opened and Commander Weiss stepped out. His uniform was spotless, his expression disturbingly calm despite the chaos around him. His eyes swept over the battered team with something close to disinterest. "Weiss?" Harlan's voice was cold steel. "What the hell are you doing here?" Weiss adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves and smiled. "Colonel Dr. Voss, I see you made it back in one piece. That's impressive, considering the circumstances." Elena took a step forward. "You knew?" Her voice trembled with rage. You knew what was down there." Weiss didn't deny it. He simply tilted his head as if considering her accusation. "What I knew," he said carefully, "is irrelevant now. What matters is containment, and you've done your part admirably." "Containment?" Cato spat, stepping forward despite his injuries. "We barely made it out alive. Those things, those Xha'ari, are still down there. And they're not just monsters. They're part of something bigger, something ancient." Weiss sighed. "Yes, we're aware." Harlan's grip on his rifle tightened. "Aware? You're telling me you sent us into that nightmare knowing full well we were walking into a hive? What was the mission, Weiss? What the hell were you trying to dig up?" Weiss met Harlan's gaze without flinching. "We weren't digging, we were recovering. The Xha'ari were engineered thousands of years ago by a species far more advanced than us. The artifact beneath Argus 9 wasn't just a relic, it was a control beacon. With it, the Xha'ari could be directed, harnessed." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "You wanted to weaponize them." Weiss's smile was thin. "Imagine an army of perfect soldiers, regenerative, adaptive, unbreakable. With the beacon, humanity wouldn't just survive, it would dominate." Harlan took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "And when your perfect army turned on the miners, what then?" Weiss shrugged. "Acceptable losses." Cato surged forward, but Harlan caught him by the shoulder, holding him back. "You son of a—" Cato's voice broke with rage. Weiss's calm demeanor finally cracked. He took a step forward, his eyes flashing with cold fury. "Do you think this is about you? About a few hundred miners? We're talking about the survival of our species. The galaxy is vast and we are weak. We need weapons like the Xha'ari if we're going to stand a chance against what's out there." Elena's voice was soft but unyielding. "You've already lost. You just don't realize it yet." Weiss opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips as the ground trembled beneath their feet. The tremor was subtle at first, a distant, almost imperceptible hum. But then it grew. Elena's heart sank. "No." A sickening crack echoed from the airlock behind them. The reinforced steel doors, bent and sealed shut, began to bulge outward. "They're coming," Cato whispered. Weiss's face twisted with disbelief. "Impossible. The chamber was destroyed." "No." Elena's voice was hollow. "We just woke them up." The doors buckled with a deafening groan, and then they split open, torn apart by something massive. The Queen. Her carapace gleamed in the dim light, her segmented body unfurling as she pulled herself through the wreckage. Black ichor dripped from her jaws, and her massive, multifaceted eyes shimmered with intelligence and rage. Weiss stumbled back, all traces of confidence gone. No, this wasn't supposed to happen." Harlan didn't hesitate. "Cato, get to the dropship. Elena, cover him." Elena raised her rifle and fired, the pulse rounds striking the Queen's armored hide. The creature screeched, its massive claws swiping through the air. Cato sprinted toward the dropship, blood trailing from his wounds. Weiss turned and ran for his shuttle, shouting into his comm. "Emergency extraction! Get me out of here!" The Queen's massive tail lashed out, impaling the shuttle midair. The hull crumpled like paper, and Weiss's scream was cut short as the shuttle exploded in a fireball. Elena barely registered the blast as she fired shot after shot at the Queen. "Harlan, we can't stop her." "I know," Harlan's voice was grim, "but we can slow her down." The Queen's massive head reared back, and a thick spray of acidic bile shot toward the landing pad. Harlan tackled Elena, throwing her clear as the acid melted through the steel. "Harlan!" Elena screamed. He pulled her to her feet and shoved her toward the dropship. "Go!" She stumbled forward, her legs burning with exhaustion. Cato was at the ship's ramp, waving her inside. The Queen shrieked behind them, the sound reverberating through the air. Elena turned one last time and saw Harlan standing his ground, rifle in hand. The Queen loomed over him, her jaws wide. Harlan's voice crackled over the comm. "Make it count, Voss." The detonator in his hand flashed red. The explosion consumed the landing pad in a blinding wave of fire and ash. The dropship shook as the force of the blast knocked it sideways, but the engines roared to life, propelling them upward. Elena pressed her hand against the window, her vision blurred with tears as the surface of Argus 9 burned beneath them. Cato's voice was quiet. He knew it was the only way. Elena closed her eyes, her mind reeling from the weight of it all. The betrayal, the horrors, the sacrifice. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The beacon had been destroyed, but the Queen had woken, and somewhere in the depths of space, they were still coming. The dropship streaked across the void, the surface of Argus 9 shrinking behind them like a dying ember. But even from orbit, the damage was clear. The moon's surface was rupturing, the impact of the blast splitting open like festering wounds. Black tendrils writhed up from the cracks, and in the distance a massive shadow unfurled, something too large, too alien to comprehend. Elena Voss sat strapped into her seat, fists clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. Every breath felt like she was dragging glass into her lungs. Cato was slumped across from her, his wounds hastily wrapped in gauze that was already darkening with blood. The cabin stank of sweat, blood, and smoke, but none of it mattered. All she could see was Harlan, standing there on that cursed landing pad, rifle in hand, defying death itself. The flash of the explosion was burned into her mind, a searing afterimage that refused to fade. Cato's voice broke through the heavy silence, weak but clear. "He gave us a chance." Elena swallowed hard. "For what? To watch it all happen again." Cato leaned forward, wincing from the pain. "No, to stop it." The pilot's voice crackled over the comm. "We're approaching the rendezvous point." Elena forced herself to look forward as the forward viewport adjusted, revealing their destination, a colossal military cruiser, the Elysium, orbiting just beyond Argus 9's gravity well. The ship's sleek hull was marked with fresh scorch marks from previous battles, its weapon arrays glinting like rows of teeth. The last hope for humanity hanging in the void. As the dropship docked, the bay doors slid open, and a contingent of armed personnel rushed to meet them. But the grim looks on their faces told Elena everything she needed to know. They'd seen the transmission. They knew what was coming, Admiral Thane stepped forward, his broad frame imposing in his dark uniform. His face was lined with exhaustion and something deeper. Fear. "Elena." His voice was low, almost reverent. "We saw the feed from Argus 9. What the hell is this?" Elena met his gaze, her throat tightening. "It's not just the Xha'ari. It's what controls them." Thane's eyes darkened. "The Queen?" "No." Elena shook her head. "She's not the end. She's the beginning. We've been thinking too small. The Xha'ari aren't invaders. They're a failsafe, a biological cleansing force. And the beacon," her voice broke. "The beacon wasn't just a signal to them, it was a warning." Thane stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "Warning us of what?" Cato pushed himself upright, his voice strained but resolute. "They're coming. The ones who made the Xha'ari, the ones who created the hive. And if they reach Earth..." He didn't need to finish. The realization hung in the air like a death knell. Admiral Thane straightened, his voice taking on the weight of command. "How long do we have?" Elena glanced at the display. The readings were almost incomprehensible, waves of energy surging from the moon's ruptured core, warping space itself. Her heart sank. "Minutes," she whispered. The silence that followed was broken by the sudden blare of alarms. The ship's AI chimed, its tone cold and emotionless. "Unidentified vessel detected, exiting subspace." Elena's heart lurched as the viewport shifted, revealing the darkness of space splitting open. A massive shape emerged, blacker than the void around it, an obsidian leviathan covered in shifting plates of bone and metal. It wasn't a ship, it was something alive. The alien construct pulsed with a terrible rhythmic glow, a heartbeat the size of a moon. Tendrils of energy arced from its surface, coiling through the void like the grasping fingers of a god. Admiral Thane's voice cut through the noise. "Target all railguns and ion cannons. Fire at will." The cruiser's hull vibrated as its weapons discharged, beams of plasma and kinetic rounds streaking toward the massive entity. They struck its surface in brilliant bursts of light, but the Leviathan didn't slow. Elena stared in horror as the creature extended its tendrils toward them, impossibly fast. They wrapped around the ship's energy shields, sending waves of distortion rippling across the hull. "It's feeding," she gasped. Thane's face was pale as he gripped the railing. "How do we kill it?" Elena's mind raced. She thought of the beacon, of the carvings in the mines, the ancient warnings left behind. The Xha'ari weren't designed to destroy the galaxy. They were designed to delay its end. "We have to overload it," she said suddenly. Thane frowned. "What do you mean?" Elena turned to Cato, her eyes blazing with resolve. "The Queen was connected to it, part of it, but we severed that link when we destroyed the hive. That thing, it's vulnerable now, but only if we hit it with enough raw energy to disrupt its form." Cato's eyes widened as realization dawned. "The core, the ship's reactor." Elena nodded grimly. "We need to detonate it. We have to turn the Elysium into a bomb." A stunned silence fell over the bridge. Thane's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, but there was none. He nodded slowly. "Understood." He turned to his crew. "All hands abandon ship. This is not a drill." Get to the escape vessels now." Alarms blared as the evacuation order spread. The crew moved with precision, fear held at bay by discipline and duty. Thane stayed behind as Elena and Cato rushed toward the reactor chamber. The core pulsed with blinding light, its containment field thrumming with energy. Cato hesitated at the controls. "There's no timer for this. Someone has to stay." Elena's heart clenched. "We'll find another way." Cato shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "No time, Elena." Tears welled in her eyes. She grabbed his arm. "You don't have to." "I do." His voice was calm, steady. He glanced back at the viewport where the Leviathan loomed ever closer. "We've all lost so much, but maybe this way we can win something back." Before she could stop him, Cato pressed the final override sequence. The core's hum rose to a deafening pitch. He turned to her one last time. "Go." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to stay, but she knew she couldn't waste his sacrifice. She stumbled back, forcing herself to move. The escape pod's hatch closed behind her, and the pod launched into the void. She watched helplessly as the Elysium glowed like a newborn star, its core reaching critical mass. The Leviathan wrapped itself tighter around the ship, unaware of the trap it had sprung. The explosion erupted in a burst of pure light, a supernova of destruction that consumed everything in its wake. The shockwave hurled the escape pods through space. Elena's pod spun wildly, the force pressing her into the seat. She closed her eyes, whispering Cato's name, whispering Harlan's name. When the light faded, the Leviathan was gone, its form scattered into oblivion. Elena drifted in silence. Her calm crackled and faint familiar voices came through. Rescue. But as she stared out into the endless stars, she felt no triumph, no relief. The galaxy was vast, and this was only the beginning. "They'll come again," she whispered, "and next time, we won't be ready." As the rescue ship closed in, the stars beyond the viewport flickered, distant and cold, and somewhere out there in the void, something ancient was watching, waiting.